Oh, okay. All right. I'll get started then. I hope everybody um, can see my screen. Um, Let me just make a request of all of you who are watching. If you would note my email address, which is simple, it's len@nuclearnewyork.org. And if you would take some notes on issues you have along the way with the way I've presented it, I find the use of these graphs, uh, for me, incredibly enlightening and clear. Other people don't have the same response to them. A lot of people turn off with graphs, so I need help in making this accessible in a clear way. In a way, this is a draft of the report that I'm preparing, which I will hope to disseminate and get some attention to. So any help you could give me by noting things that you see that could be improved or made clearer uh, would be very welcome. So I'm Len Rodberg. Short background, I was trained as a theoretical physicist. Um, I, for good or ill, joined the State Department to work on nuclear disarmament under the Kennedy administration. And I, in a way, never went back to pure physics. I've been doing public policy ever since. I chaired the Urban Studies Department at Queens College for 22 years. It was a public policy, is a public policy department, and we taught everything from urban poverty to climate change. Um, and since I retired 7 years ago, I've been working on climate and energy and discovered several years ago a computer program that I'll talk about shortly that I think is incredibly enlightening for those of us concerned about energy and the elimination of fossil fuels. So let me get started. The project is funded by the Alex Walker Foundation and the Anthropocene Institute, uh, with the idea that I will look at the decarbonizing the grid in California and in Georgia, where a leader of the Walker Foundation is based. Very different places. California, my California report is what you're about to see. So let me get started. Um, so sometime recently, Bill McKibben made a visit to Mark Jacobson's home. And the result is this article that he published in the New Yorker a few weeks ago, claiming that California is showing how a big state can power itself without fossil fuels. And I'll read you this quote from the article that McKibben wrote and published. For some portion of almost every day, a combination of solar, wind, geothermal, and hydropower, that is renewables, has been producing more than 100% of the state's demand for electricity. California has proved that it's possible to run a thriving modern economy on clean energy. The description of what's happening at the moment is true, but that conclusion is false. It's simply not true. And I'm going to show you the reality here. In a way, I'm giving away my bottom line here, because this is, if you like, the key takeaway from what I'm going to tell you for the rest of this presentation. This is a graph showing for the entire year, the energy produced by each source in the California grid for each hour of the day. So what it does is take for the hour between 8 and 9, it sums up all of the solar energy generated in the course of the year during that hour. And it looks at each hour over the whole year. So what do you see? You wake up in the morning at 8 o'clock and the sun is rising. Excuse me. And it's there's over the years, it's the major source of energy. This is in 2045 projection, according to California's basic plan, which I'm calling SB 100 core plan. SB 100 is the law setting up the goal of a decarbonized grid in 2045. So it has a lot of solar. I'll give you more numbers in a few minutes. There's so much solar that over the course of the year, there's a lot of excess solar, and that's used to charge batteries. There are also a lot of batteries installed in California. Already, there are 10 gigawatts of batteries, and they're aiming for, I believe it's around 40, maybe 50 gigawatts. That red bump at the top is the charging of batteries above the load that the grid is facing, which is the line that goes across the screen. The dashes are curtailments, that is excess solar and wind, that is more than is needed, and so it's dumped. It's not produced. So the sun comes up and it goes down again by 4 o'clock. And what you see is, on average over the year, the sun produces energy for 8 hours out of the 24, 1/3 of the day. What happens the rest of the time? Well, the purple there is the batteries discharging. So the batteries discharge, but they're not enough to make it through the whole day, and you get the gray. And what's the gray? The gray is natural gas. Natural gas continues in California's grid to be a major component of its output. It's required. It's the dispatchable source that responds to the varying demands placed upon the grid in the course of the day, and particularly at night. So for 2/3 of the night, you're burning gas. A shorthand way of saying this, the Californians who own electric vehicles, who have bought Teslas or whatever electric vehicle they get, they'll be charging that, if they charge it at night, which is the typical time to charge a personal vehicle, they will be charging it with a fossil fuel. So that's the punchline. Let me show you where that comes from. So here's an outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to describe California's current plan for decarbonizing its grid. I'll describe a new model that I use to analyze it. I'll show you the gaps in the plan that the model shows. I'll give you examples of workable plans in contrast to this plan, which is clearly not a decarbonization plan. And I'll draw my conclusions at the end. So California's plan is based on a set of laws. Most of my slides will not have all these words, but excuse me, I apologize for all the words here. But they're basically 2 laws that are governing California's climate planning. One was passed in 2006, and it basically set the decarbonization goal of achieving carbon neutrality. That is, not producing any more carbon than they could capture by various means. I assume offsets, trees, maybe direct air or water capture. And then a second law, which is SB 100, Senate Bill 100, which sets the goal of having 100% what they call retail sales of electricity by 2045. This is a very different approach than New York took, by the way. But these are the fundamental laws. They aim to achieve the combination of these two by electrifying as much as possible if they can the economy. There's electrifying transportation and building heating. And under AB 32, they've created various subsidies and penalties for, that is, after 2035, only electric vehicles can be sold in California. and there's a similar deadline, I don't recall it right now, for building heating. So these are the goals. There's one other law that's of interest, which is the Warren-Alquist Act. In 1974, it created the California Energy Commission, which is overseeing this entire process. In 1976, nearly 50 years ago, it was amended to establish a moratorium on building new nuclear plants in California until the federal government solves the nuclear waste problem for them, the waste disposal problem. That's currently the situation, that you can't build a new nuclear plant in California. So here's the projection of electric load California, that there are 3 agencies involved in California's energy planning, really 4. 3 were involved in this. One is the California Energy Commission. Second is the California Public Utility Commission, which oversees the utilities. And the third is the California Air Resources Board, which is responsible for dealing with air pollution, including carbon pollution. The 4th agency is the California Independent System Operator, CAISO, at least that's the way I pronounce it, which oversees the grid and which provides the data that I've used to do the analysis that led to that graph that I've shown you and others that I'll show you shortly. So the blue here is obviously the base load. It's the base general electric use in California, slated to grow slightly, but then added to it is, excuse me, the electrification of transportation, of some of it, the electrification of building heating and hot water heating, and then hydrogen production, but it's so small that you can't see it on the graph. So that's the target that we have. That is that's the load that has to be met by the grid. By 2045, it's supposed to be clean. I will explain shortly what clean means here. I would note this is from the Air Resources Board, that electricity actually accounts for only a small part of the emissions that California and any other place, including New York, emits. But the idea is to reduce the emissions on these other sectors by electrifying them and making the grid clean. So here's how they under SB 100, how they set the goal. Remember, SB 100 says that retail sales of electricity have to be, that is the electricity sold to people or to businesses or industrial users, has to be 100% clean. That is not from the burning of fossil fuels. That, however, does not include all the electricity that's generated. They've created a loophole for themselves, and it's in this figure from the report of the joint energies, the 3 agencies. It's called line losses. That is the transmission losses in moving electricity around the state or importing it from other states. Is not required to be clean, and so that allows them to keep burning gas. But in fact, the model I'm using for California has no transmission losses. So all the gas that was burned in the figure that I showed you earlier is meeting that retail sales need, not line losses. So here's their plan. This is the governor's report on it last year. It's a result of about 6 years of analysis, much of it done by a consulting firm in California called E3. That stands for Energy and Environmental Economics, Inc., they also did the analysis for New York State, for NYSERDA. And the plan that they've shown here is all renewable. Natural gas doesn't appear anyplace here because it's not supposed to be in a source of any of the electricity that people get. But in fact, the analysis that E3 has done continues to have some gas, as I'll show you in a second. So here are the sources you see today. There's a total of 35,000 megawatts, 35 gigawatts of capacity in these various renewable and related sources. As biomass is treated there as renewable, the battery storage, presumably the batteries are charged by renewable sources. Geothermal, they're proposing to put in offshore wind, although there is none right now. Both utility scale solar and wind. Utility scale solar is the big source that they're envisioning to use. Wind grows slightly, but solar grows a great deal, by a factor of 6. Wind is doubled by the 2045, solar by a factor of 6, and storage by a factor of 5 from today. So this is the plan. You'll notice that it says this is to provide 100% clean electricity. That's what they're claiming their plan will do. This, I'm showing you, this is again from this joint agency report of 2021, which is the foundational document that guides the planning of the grid. It is the only figure I was able to find that includes the gas that's actually burned. And you can see it, it's the gray color at the bottom of the bar. And it shows the growth of solar. It also, the line is emissions. It shows that you still have substantial emissions in 2045. So in fact, this graph admits that they're continuing to burn gas, but nothing else that I've been able to discover in this report or anyplace else, including, as I just showed you, the governor's plan, refers to the burning of gas. So again, here's an excerpt from a document the Energy Commission, the California Energy Commission, published on this plan, 100% clean electricity. And it shows quantitatively, and the right-hand column is what I've modeled using the software I'm about to describe to you. And you can see that solar explodes. Well, I shouldn't use that term really, but grows from 12 to 69 gigawatts over the next 25 years. No nuclear. Remember, there's a moratorium. No hydrogen, no biomass. Very tiny amount of geothermal, and a doubling of wind. So basically, it's a solar plant. And you could see that in that graph I showed you at the beginning. So that's the California plan. These are the creators of the model for the grid that I'm using. Rainer Kohr spent nearly 50 years as an engineer at Stone & Webster, designing and overseeing the building of power plants. Ahmad works for X Energy and is a computer programmer, very talented. 2 papers have been produced so far by this little center that they've created using the software. One, they did an analysis of New England's grid up through 2030. And then I did an analysis similar to the one I'm showing you here on New York's plan for decarbonizing its grid by 2040. We got very similar results to what I'm going to show you here for California. Let me compare this. I want to compare the CACI model with the current model that California uses, that New York used, and that many other Western state uses. It's called the Resolve computer model. That's an acronym. I can't tell you what it stands for. It's what's called a linear programming model. It optimizes a 20-year or 25-year scenario to find the combination of sources that will give you the minimum cost. This requires, of course, that you assume costs for all the sources that you're putting in, and the result depends on those costs. I'm not focused. I'm going to give you some cost numbers, but they're not the focus of what I've done with the CACI model. The thing about linear programming model for energy, it can tell you how much energy, it tries to tell you how much energy a source produces, but it can't tell you when it produces it or whether it's needed at the time it produces it. The renewables are modeled in this linear programming model by assigning a capacity factor to them. Capacity factor is the ratio of what a source like solar energy produces in the course of a year compared to what it could produce with a maximum it could conceivably produce. In California, the capacity factor is roughly 22 to 25%. In New York, it's 14%. The model I'm using doesn't take capacity factors as inputs. It gives you a capacity factor, calculates the capacity factor. So they put in a capacity factor in order to recognize that the source is intermittent, but they can't tell you when it's produced or how intermittent it is. So it disguises the intermittent time and weather-dependent character of solar and wind. Furthermore, the E3 model has another limitation. Not all linear programming models do. Some of you might know the work of Jesse James. His model doesn't do this, doesn't make this assumption. They look only at 37 representative days in a given year. That is 1/10 of the days. They're doing this in order to shorten the running time for the model, so they can do a lot of different scenarios. One problem with that is you can't evaluate how useful batteries are, because battery use can run over from one day to the next. You know, if a day is sunny, maybe that day doesn't need the battery, but the following day is cloudy and it would need it. So you can't do that if you only have 37 days out of the year. The CACI model is an hourly dispatch model. It looks at a single year, and it looks at every hour within that single year, and it calculates for every hour how much energy is produced by each source, starting with, there's two categories of sources. There's one that in the model we call non-dispatchable. That is, they're relatively fixed, and they produce their energy. If you have nuclear plants, they run all the time. If you have solar, it produces energy whether you want it or not. The wind produces whether you want it or not. Hydro, you can vary some, but for the purpose of this model, of simplifying it by just taking it as relatively fixed. And it looks at every hour in a given year, and it dispatches the sources according to their needs. So you first take the output for that hour of the non-dispatchable sources. For solar and wind, I use the data from 2023. CAISO will tell us, has the data for how much solar and wind was produced in 2023 for every hour, in fact, for every 5 minutes of every hour for 2023. And we know how much solar there was installed, or we have an estimate of that. And so we can use that to know how effective the solar was each hour of each day during that year. Once the non-dispatchables are taken care of, if they haven't met the full load, then the dispatchable sources are introduced. And in today's world in California, there are two. One is batteries. So if there are batteries that have charge, you discharge them. Doesn't cost you anything to discharge them. And so you discharge them. And if you still have load remaining, then you use whatever flexible source you have, whatever dispatchable source you have to meet the rest of the load. And in California today, and in their plan for the foreseeable future, that variable source is natural gas. Finally, the model charges the batteries from excess solar and wind output. So whenever there's solar and wind that isn't needed, in other words, you've met the load and you still have some solar output potentially, you look to see if the batteries need charging, and if they do, you charge them. Same with wind. If you still have solar left, you curtail it. That is, you throw away the potential for that energy. So that's those are two models. I'm using the khaki model. And I won't go through the details here, but basically I take the 2023 data, calibrate the system according using that data, which is very well documented from CAISO. And then I calculate for a given year, 2045, and given set of amounts of solar and wind, which I've shown you earlier, how much energy is used by each of those from each of those sources, and basically create a set of tables and graphs. There really are no assumptions other than this is a single zone model, as I'm not assuming any losses or any curtailment as a result of barriers to transmission across the state. I'll tell you an interesting little factoid. It's widely known that there's been substantial amount of curtailment, particularly of solar energy in California over the last several years. My model finds almost none. And the reason is that CAISO has just disclosed that almost all of the curtailment that occurred last year in California was a result of congestion in the transmission system. That is, there was electricity that was needed in one zone and that was produced in another, but they weren't able to transmit it from one zone to the other, from one area to the other, because there was inadequate transmission capability between the areas of California. And since I use a one zone model, I don't have that kind of congestion in my model. And so I have very little curtailment. So here's today's grid in California. The way I would suggest reading this is starting at the bottom. I've put the legend on the left. You start from the bottom. That's the existing Diablo Canyon plant producing constantly over the year. Then there's large hydro and Northwest hydro. That is hydro imported from the Columbia River Basin, which is sort of like contracted, substantial part of the import. Then there's other renewables. That includes geothermal and some biomass and small hydro plants. Then there's imports from places like Wyoming, where they still burn coal. It's not a big contributor, but it's in here, and CAISO records it. Then there's the wind, the existing wind farms in California. Then the first yellow is that's rooftop solar. Then there's utility solar. And then you see those little purple blips above the rooftop solar. That's the discharge of batteries. And you can see it's primarily in the spring. I'll explain that in a little while. Well, it's simple. The load is small in the spring, relatively low in the spring. There's little heating needed. And yet the sun is quite bright in California. And so the batteries can get charged. That's the little red stripes you see up there. So the batteries are charged and they're discharged. But there's still a gap. That's expected. We're not at the target year yet. This is 2023. So that's the burning of gas is the rest of what's shown in that graph. And the data is shown on the right, the capacity of each of the sources. The which are the renewable sources, plus the natural gas, which produces today about 38% of the load, carries the load, that much of the load, and produces 92,000 gigawatt hours in a year. The cost of this is for total generation cost is I'm not sure the number there is I'm not sure I'm not sure that it's an up-to-date number in terms of my calculations. I'll go over the cost a little later. Okay, so here's 4 days in that year, not randomly chose. They're each season. So this is, the one on the upper left is January 1st. The sun is still bright and reasonably bright in California in January, but it doesn't rise enough to be able to charge the batteries in January. But the rest is of the day and evening is filled with gas, covering the rest of the need. The next is April 1st. There you can see the load is down. The sun is up, and the sun is up enough that it can charge the batteries some, not very much though, because the battery is very quickly discharged and becomes empty. Doesn't cover much at all. The next, July 1st, lower left, there's a lot more sun. The scale is actually bigger. There's a lot more sun than previously, but there's a lot more load too because of air conditioning. And so they never charge the battery. There's no batteries helping you out on July 1st. Then the last one in the lower right is October, and again the load is down some. Less air conditioning, maybe no air conditioning. There's enough sun to have a little bit of battery charge and a little bit of discharge, but basically the batteries that they have in California so far are not making much contribution. But you can see that sun even now is the major source of energy besides natural gas. Okay, so now what I do is look at 2045 using the numbers using the size of each of the sources I showed you earlier. And this is the result. It looks quite exciting. That's the coloring maybe. What you're seeing there is expanded rooftop solar. Well, the wind is still a small portion of the sources. California, as I said, planning to expand wind only doubling it, whereas solar and the batteries are expanded by factors of 5 or 6. So there's a lot of rooftop solar, a lot of utility solar, a lot of batteries. There's a lot of solar, so that there's a lot of battery being charged. You can see that in the red at the top. And above it is curtailment. That is, there's so much solar that on many days there's an excess that has to be discarded. And then the batteries are charged, and then they're discharged at night. The interesting thing is that you can see that natural gas plays a role every day of the year. Natural gas is essential to keep the grid operating. And if you look at the table on the right, remember 92,000 gigawatt hours was what gas being burned today. 75,000 gigawatt hours of energy being used, burned from natural gas. It provides about 18% of all the load. And it's basically in the late, always in the late evening and early morning, because the batteries by then are depleted and the sun isn't available yet. Here's the seasons in 2045. The sun is, the demand is higher. There's a lot more sun, a lot more solar energy. It charges the batteries. The batteries last longer, but they're soon depleted. Particularly in January, they don't get fully charged because there really isn't quite enough sun to fully charge the batteries that have been installed. And then natural gas takes over for most of the January evening. In April, you can see that it doesn't need that particular day didn't need natural gas. The load was low and the sun was high, and it charged up the battery, and the batteries were able to last the whole night through. But by July, the battery doesn't last all night, and same in October. You need to, if you're going to keep the lights on or the power going and the data centers running, you need to have natural gas burning almost every night. You might say, why not add more? Let's do more solar. Let's go even much more than I already have. Of course, it's taking over farmland and so on, but let's forget that and let's have more, and we'll be able to eliminate the use of gas. No, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because there are days that are cloudy. There are days that are totally overcast. There are days where it's raining. The batteries don't get charged. And so when night comes, there's no batteries to run. You've got to depend on some source for 2/3 of the day or the evening and night. And natural gas is the only source in the state's model. A grid needs a dispatchable, reliable source. And the only such source that the state is planning on at the moment is natural gas. Here's an example. If you look at a week in December, I choose December because that's when the sun is weakest, of course. So here, even in December, sometimes the load is small enough. This is 2045 again, but there's so much solar installed and so many batteries that the solar can charge the batteries a little bit, but they quickly get discharged. They're not fully charged by that winter sun. But you can see that during that week, there are 4 of the 7 days in which the sun solar energy never gets strong enough to charge the batteries at all. So you got no choice at night but to burn gas. So gas is burned throughout the year in 2045, in spite of the claim that the state is going to have 100% clean electric grid. Here's a comparison of the sources between 2023 last year and 2045. And I just circled the 2 numbers for gas. The gas capacity increases. It's increased in the E3 model that they run, and I found that it had to be increased, or else you had a gap you had unmet load. You didn't have enough energy being produced to meet the demand. And the decline in gas use is not quite 20%. So you're still burning almost as much gas as you're burning now. Okay, so California need what we call a DFR. They need a dispatchable, emission-free resource. That is a source that can track the load and meet the difference between what the fixed sources are making available and what is needed. There's a large gap between what the renewable sources provide and what's needed. As I pointed out, installing more renewables won't help because there are always days when you get what the Germans call Dunkelflaut. No sun and no wind. You don't charge the batteries. You got to have something, and you want it to be clean. Every grid needs a firm dispatchable resource, able to match the continuing fluctuations in demand. Currently, it's natural gas. California needs a dispatchable, emission-free resource. So what should it be? Here's the example that I've used here and that I used in my New York study. This is the Natrium reactor that TerraPower, Bill Gates' firm, is beginning to install in Wyoming. It's a combination of a reactor and a storage system. The reactor produces basically liquid sodium, transfers to salts and heats up the salts in that storage tank. The storage tank is then very, very hot, hundreds of degrees centigrade. Depending on the need of the load of the grid that it's attached to, it's used to produce steam and run the turbines. An interesting thing about this is it's air cooled, so it doesn't have to be near a river, doesn't need cooling towers. It's air cooled. The right hand portion, the non-nuclear portion, is cooled is air cooled, and the reactor is cooled by sodium cooled fast neutron reactor. So if I put that in, I get this. I've just basically replaced gas with that flex nuclear, and you can see it covers about 70% of the load, but it's quite expensive. Let's say the figure before should have been around $102. Well, yeah. The current cost of electricity is about $102, according to this model, $102 per megawatt hour, 10 cents a megawatt hour. That's wholesale cost, unsubsidized. The subsidies take about half. So in fact, if you go to CAISO's website, you'll find that they're currently paying about $50 per megawatt hour. But this is costly. It's costly because the nuclear plant is costed at current expected costs of nuclear power, which are high. The model I'm using assumes costs that are used by E3 that are comparable with those that are from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, their ATB. And basically, they're assuming that solar and wind costs will continue to drop and will drop by 50% by 2045. So the nuclear is first of a kind cost in a way, and the renewable costs are low. But this is fairly expensive at this model at this point. Here's an alternative which has some substantial virtues. This is replacing 80% of the renewables with base load nuclear, building some more Diablo Canyons. I put in 30 gigawatts. The Diablo Canyon I put in 15, I added 15 new Diablo Canyon base load nuclear plants. 15 plants is, in the 1960s and 70s, building 15 nuclear plants was considered an easy feat. Anyway, today it's considered difficult, but I put it in, and this is the result, and shows the figures there, that the flex nuclear is still needed because you still need to be dispatchable. You still need to be able to follow the load. There's not much, because I've cut back on the amount of renewables, there's not much curtailment needed any longer. That is, there's no waste, very low waste of resources. And I don't have any batteries. If you have a big base load like that, you don't need batteries. They don't pay for themselves. That is, I cost optimize this. Another example of a DFR, so that's one DFR, that is one dispatchable emission-free resource, is a nuclear plant with basically a battery storage system, in this case, thermal salts. Another example is hydrogen. Hydrogen is a clean source, particularly if it's produced cleanly, that's produced by non-carbon sources. The turbines can run it. Existing turbines, you have to change the burners, some of the software, but you can run it, and you store it in these tanks. It's not easy to store. It's expensive to store, but the federal government is aiming for a 10-year program that by 2031 will have hydrogen available at $1 per kilogram. Today it's about $10 or $12 per kilogram. And today it's produced by burning natural gas. But this, if you can produce it by electrolysis, and one way to produce it is by using a nuclear plant, and we're doing that up at 9 Mile Point. We're using a nuclear plant there to produce hydrogen. Not at $1 a kilogram yet, but if we assume that the cost of this model here, in which the nuclear component, that base load of the 15 Diablo Canyons, is costed at current prices, which is about $6,000 a kilowatt. But you can see that because the hydrogen is cheap and you don't have to build new plants, you can use existing turbines. The cost of electricity is about similar to what it is today, even without reducing the price of nuclear plants. Here's a comparison of the various costs. Electricity today, the 2020-45 core model of that the state has. If the solar and wind costs are what they are today, electricity would be $168. If they're the 50% reductions I described earlier, they'd be about 101. So they're claiming that by using those assumed cost reductions, that electricity won't cost any more in 2045 than it costs today. However, it won't be clean because of all the gas they're burning. So here are the costs of the models I've shown you. If you're using the existing values that are given for nuclear plants, it's fairly expensive. But if we can get the cost of nuclear down, there's an example. If you cut the cost to $3,000 a kilowatt, the Koreans are installing them. They installed them in UAE for less. It gets down to where the costs of electricity are today, and similarly with hydrogen. So nuclear can be done cost effectively, and it's clean, and there's really no other alternative for the DFR that's absolutely essential if you want to have a clean grid. So here are my conclusions. California's plan will not significantly reduce the consumption of fossil-based natural gas by its grid. California's widely used grid planning model gives misleading results for the operation of intermittent renewables and the consumption of natural gas. If you want to have decarbonized electrification, you need a large emission-free dispatchable source that has to operate throughout the year. Nuclear can provide it, both directly and by cost-effectively producing clean hydrogen. California, if it wants to decarbonize, has to remove its outdated moratorium on new nuclear installations. Recognize that nuclear waste is not such a big problem. In fact, an outfit in California called Deep Isolation has a very neat solution to it. You just use your oil drilling technology and drill a hole a mile down and drop it down the hole. That's a little oversimplified, but it works. And finally, large-scale building of renewables is wasteful. It doesn't achieve the goal of a clean grid, and it'll make the transition more difficult and certainly more costly and certainly more environmentally destructive. So thank you, and I welcome comments and questions. And I'll stop the share now.
This is Gene Nelson, Californians for Green Nuclear Power. I've been commenting as you've been going along. There's a whole bunch of comments in the chat.
Good.
Um,
I haven't
and
read them, so yeah.
I understand you're presenting, so you shouldn't be
Yeah.
reading.
Yep.
Uh, but the overall message is um, it's like things like resolve make it so that nuclear power advocates are fighting with probably both hands tied behind their back because it was a tool designed to promote the use of solar and wind. And that the feature that you talked about where that fails to monitor or track hour by hour usage is actually very intentional. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
Uh-huh. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm interested in that, and I would like to know more.
Okay.
I think that's an important thing I've learned in the course of this. That the model is but is defective, and it's not a tool for understanding renewables. Or maybe it's a tool for misunderstanding them, you're suggesting.
That's the case. We really need a much better model that is energy source agnostic. That does not exist at this time.
Well, maybe we have it here.
The other issue is that California has a very unique legal euphemism called unspecified sources. And the goal of unspecified sources was to disguise the use of out-of-state coal-fired power. And that was actually, from what we're able to determine, it was implemented as a consequence of coal industry lobbying. And this is, you know, the PUC in February of 2021 passed what was the largest procurement order in their history. And they did it very sneakily because they just specified it as a capacity. And when you put in, and the goal was, of course, to replace Diablo Canyon. So you have to substitute the capacity factor for Diablo Canyon. And when you do that, you discover it was an absolutely absurdly large procurement, and it's all based on unspecified sources. So it's definitely a real central part of this. The real villain in California is Berkshire Hathaway Energy subsidiary Pacific Corp. We now have some information that's consistent with the perspective that they actually helped to lobby to unnecessarily shut down San Onofre nuclear generating station at the end of January 2012. And they have profited very handsomely just looking at one of their markets that they helped to design. They've so far netted about $1 billion in sales of coal-fired power into California.
Hmm.
So there's definitely some really nasty stuff going on here in terms of excuse me, what's in store. They're also doing some lobbying at the federal level through a very obscure bureaucracy called WIEB CREPC. Um, and it's a very innocuously named Pathways Initiative, and the goal is to produce a West-wide RTO or ISO. And based on some very important legal decisions, both before the U.S. Supreme Court and before FERC, California environmental laws regarding electricity generation will all be able to be challenged by Berkshire Hathaway Pacific Corp subsidiary if that actually comes to pass, which of course is why they're pushing for it. And I mean, they are spending record amounts directly lobbying the state. And of course, there's no disclosure on how much they're spending to lobby at the federal level. But it's really all about, it's just business for them. And if they can shut down Diablo Canyon, they'll get more business.
Len, in the capacity factors for nuclear in your tables, why are the why is there such a difference between new nuclear and conventional and existing nuclear? I mean, it's a dramatic difference.
Well, there's a difference between new nuclear and flex nuclear. The flex nuclear is just runs to meet demand, so it's not a base load system.
Right.
New
All right,
nuclear,
I got it. I misread that. All right.
yeah. New nuclear is base load, so it's in the 90%.
Hi, this is something I didn't see, but there's also the question of kind of traditional pump hydro storage, which I think California has several gigawatts of existing. And obviously there's the possibility of building more of that. That's kind of a traditional storage source that has in the past been used in concert with nuclear.
Yeah, it's very small, and I should have mentioned that I made a decision not to. It's a require a substantial modification of the model to add another storage source, which is compared to the batteries that are being installed still quite small. I mean, I think it's like 2 gigawatts total, this pump storage, and they already have 10 gigawatts of batteries just in the last 2 years. They gave subsidies to the utilities to install batteries, and they're up to 10 gigawatts already.
And finally, there's an issue called synchronous grid inertia, or just inertia. And batteries don't produce significant amounts of synchronous grid inertia. Nuclear power plants, on the other hand, produce huge amounts. ERCOT, the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, came out with a 2018 study showing that nuclear power plants are the big dog in the room. And you have to have that, particularly on a grid where you've got lots of solar and wind. Otherwise, the grid is unstable and prone to blackouts.
Right. It's an AC system, and the phase relationships have to be maintained.
It's more about the rate of change.
Gas provides that function today, and the DEFR, whatever it is, will have to provide that function in the clean grid that California and the rest of us will hopefully be developing. But that's one of the roles of the DEFR, is to maintain the stability of the grid.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they won't say the word nuclear. They just talk about DEFR, and that is a very intentional propaganda move on their part, because you really need nuclear power. France and Sweden are two prime examples of showing how successful it can be if you have the political will. And the thing is, if we take the perspective of, oh yeah, we've got to fight with both hands behind our back, we're going to lose. We have to be a bit more aggressive in our advocacy for nuclear power, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, E3 has a category they call of scenario they call study, which basically means scenarios that include nuclear but don't use the word. They call it something like non-renewable dispatchable source, or clean non-renewable source, unspecified. And they participated several years ago in a well-known study of California, which unfortunately used these linear programming models, and showed that a system that had a DEFR that had firm capacity was a lot less expensive than one that has only renewables, where you try to really be renewable, not just renewable with gas, and you hide it, you don't talk about it. But they didn't use a model that actually showed what was really going on, and that's what I'm doing here, is showing what really is going on. I hope I'll look at the chat later, and
I've just archived a copy of it, because if you don't archive it before the session is closed, you lose it.
You're right.
I have that and I can email it to you.
Yeah, well, okay, do that, please.
All right.
I hope some of you may have made some notes, and if they're not in the chat, send them to me. Remember, my email address is len@nuclearnewyork.org. And thank you for watching and listening. And I appreciate your coming and sharing this experience.
Thank you for your work on this, Len.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodberg.
Yep.